Okay, welcome to Unit 4, Making Ethical Decisions. In review, ethics is an action, a practice of deciding between a right and a wrong or between two rights in a particular situation and then acting on it. We have learned thus far that before you can decide, you need to recognize that you're facing an ethical dilemma or a moral temptation. That is, developing your ethical sensitivity, determining if you are the responsible actor, gathering the relevant facts, identifying ethical wrongs, and then, if there are no ethical wrongs, identifying ethical dilemmas. Remember, if you have identified that you are indeed facing an ethical wrong in step 4, you should not go on to identify ethical dilemmas because, as Kidder notes, if you do, you are likely to justify a wrong as a right. So if you've identified an ethical wrong and you are the actor whose actions would be committing the wrong, you should choose not to do the action, but you may need help from Unit 5 to learn how to do that. However, if you're the actor who is observing a potential wrong being committed, you may be facing an ethical dilemma. Regardless of whether you are or not, you'll need to learn the techniques for making the ethical decision. So, let's move on to do that. Keep in mind that the very idea of ethics involves judgment. There is a judgment of obligation, what ought one to do, of value, what things are good to do, and principles. What principles do I want to emphasize? For example, one might argue that we are morally obligated to report cheating when we see it, but we might find it morally acceptable to simply do something about the cheating. In other words, we strive for an idea, but we may not always reach it. In our class, we are focused on developing the knowledge and skills necessary to say and do what we ought to do, not on describing ethics as seen from a variety of viewpoints. We will use Cohen's framework illustrated here. Ethics is about making judgments about actions that can be justified based on principles. So when we make an ethical judgment, for example, she should not have copied from her neighbor's test, we must back it up with justification that is supported by facts. For example, she should not have copied from her neighbor's test because doing so is cheating, as defined by our policy on integrity of scholarship. And then we can back up our justifications with principles, which are supported by logic. For example, she should not have copied from her neighbor's test because doing so is cheating, and cheating is wrong because it diminishes the quality of the teaching and learning environment, for example. To argue without justification and principles means that our judgments do not have integrity, that is, cohesion or consistency in logic. And when this happens, our actions will not be aligned with our judgment, which leads to hypocrisy. So, we have to start with some understanding of ways between discerning between rights and wrongs or between two rights. We've already covered core or fundamental values, and thinking about those values, and deciding which values you want to uphold, and then choosing the action to uphold those is one way to proceed. But what if it is not that easy? What if two values conflict, or you don't know which values are impacted by a decision? We can then turn to the foundations of ethical thought and reasoning. In Kidder's book, he talks about three main resolution principles: ends-based, rule-based, and care-based. We will also be talking about a fourth one, virtues-based. In the end-based resolution principle, an action is judged as right or wrong, ethical or unethical, by what happens as a result of that action. That is, the end result of acting. This resolution principle is dependent on a universal objective standard, which is happiness or pleasure. In other words, it makes a judgment of value first. It determines that happiness or pleasure is the good. In fact, it is the only good that matters. And then it makes a judgment of obligation, what one ought to do to evoke the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure. In ends-based resolution principle, an action is determined to be right when it elicits the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, or maximizes benefits and minimizes costs. Note that Kidder just mentions the greatest good for the greatest number, but it is really about net benefits, the greatest good for the least amount of harm. In fact, when you're looking at certain actions, two contradictory actions may both bring good consequences. So you have to choose the one that has the greatest utility, or at the very least, the least worse or the less worse disutility. Businesses are generally formed and operated according to end-based principles. This is the most common resolution principle you'll hear people talking about, even if they haven't studied ethics. It's kind of the natural way we think. We in Bazerman and Tenbunzel talk to us about having an outcome bias, that we focus so much on the outcome in determining ethical actions. But it is rooted in a philosophical ethical tradition called consequentialism, or in this case we're calling it ends-based thinking. So summary of ends-based principle. A utility other than happiness or pleasure, for example, honesty or fairness, does not hold any value as always good. So, for example, according to the ends-based resolution principle, honesty may be right in some circumstances but wrong in others. In other words, the ends justify the means. In the ends-based resolution principle, the maximizing of happiness and pleasure is just as important as the minimizing of unhappiness and pain. So it is the net benefit that matters, not majority rules. Also important is it's long-term utility that matters. The ends-based principle would say that short-term gains cannot supersede long-term pain. And since we can't predict the future, we go with the expected consequences or the more likely than not consequences. And generally speaking, we can always rely on rules of thumb for everyday ethical issues. For example, we could have a rule of thumb that we always choose the truth because it is more likely than not to produce happiness than pain most of the time. But if there is a conflict, you always go back to rule number 1, which is to maximize happiness and minimize pain. There are some criticisms of the end-based principle. It's not always practical in real life. For example, how can you possibly foresee all of the consequences or all of the people who will be impacted by your decision? It also doesn't take into account care or loyalty to those closest to us. For example, should I clothe my kids who already have stuffed closets, or clothe my neighbor's kids who need clothes? More happiness would be brought by clothing my neighbor's kids, but most people would choose to clothe their own kids. However, a criticism of this criticism is that the principle doesn't ask us to consider what we want to do, but what we should do based on the greatest utility. Clothing the neighbor's kids would be morally better along the scale of normal to Mother Teresa ethics, but most of us aren't Mother Teresa. Another counter-criticism would say then work favoritism would be okay too, and most people would say not. So this criticism that ends-based principle doesn't take into account care and loyalty has its own counter-criticisms, but just be aware that that is a criticism and a struggle that people have with this principle. A final criticism of the ends-based principle is it saying that the ends justify the means? And if so, does that result in more cheating and lying than a good person would actually tolerate? For example, we've seen this in the sports and doping scandals. We've been putting up with doping because we actually like to see hitters hit further and runners run faster. But is this really the kind of cheating and lying that we are willing to tolerate? Ends-based principle might also support low hourly wages for higher shareholder profits because there's the greatest amount of happiness for the least amount of pain. But is that really what a good person would want to tolerate? So again, the ends-based principle doesn't take into consideration good. It just takes into consideration the greatest amount of happiness for the least amount of pain. So that's the ends-based principle. The rule-based principle says that we have an obligation to act according to duty. It's otherwise known as the categorical imperative from Kant, the philosopher. In other words, we should only do an action if it can be translated into a universal principle for all of us to do. The rule-based principle insists on the internal consistency of the action, and it does not allow for exceptions. For example, you cannot say that you will tell the truth in this setting but not in others. Or you can't say that you can cheat but that others must refrain from cheating. In other words, if it is valid for you, it must be valid for others. There must be a universal acceptability. So summary of rule-based principle. There is a universal acceptability to it. A core tenet of this principle is that people are ends, not means. So you cannot use people to achieve an end. They are the ends in and of themselves. Also central to this principle is that people are autonomous agents who deserve to act on their own, not because you manipulated them to act. For example, a rule-based person would say that you wouldn't lie to someone to save them pain. The receiver of the information deserves to be able to choose how to respond to the truth. Whereas an ends-based thinker might say that it's okay to lie to someone to save them pain. Never cheat, lie, or steal, or doing the right thing even when no one is watching are phrases that would be uttered by a rule-based principle thinker. There are some criticisms of rule-based principle, however. People say that it's too strict. It doesn't allow for individuality. And what if two duties conflict? How would you then choose between the two of them? Also, it depends on the capacity of reason. It is rooted in the intrinsic worth of rational human beings. Therefore, it doesn't apply to animals or the earth or incapacitated humans. So it's difficult to apply that to some of the scenarios that we think of, like environmentalism. However, in this class, it's a very handy principle to follow and to think about. Now we move on to care-based principle. This is really the golden rule, or putting yourself in others' shoes. Imagining yourself as an object rather than the agent. Do unto others as you would do unto them, as you would have them do unto you. This sets limits on our actions because it's really always about thinking about other people and what they would want and how it'll impact them. So this care-based principle really encourages the promotions of others' interests. There are criticisms of care-based principle. Some say it's too simplistic because it's a derivative of the rule-based principle. You know, if you think about the rule-based principle says you only do actions that you're willing to become universal law or the universal norm. And so some would say, well, in that case, that the care-based principle is derivative of that because I would only want to do things that I would want to have others do unto me. But there is something more to the care-based principle than that. It is really about putting others' interests and thinking about the care of others first. Others say it's not sufficiently specific to be a guide. This kind of do unto others as you would have them do unto you is so vague and so open to interpretation. What if both parties involved are immoral or amoral? For example, I like to be bribed, so I'll bribe others. So it can be used to justify immoral actions. And also a criticism of this is how do you determine who is the most relevant other? Who do you pick? This goes back to the idea of loyalty. In the ends-based principle, it doesn't consider loyalty. Well, part of that problem is that it's difficult to figure out to whom should I care for, to whom should I be loyal. So then we move on to the fourth resolution principle, which is virtues-based. This principle says the right thing to do is the thing that makes you the person you want to be. In other words, behavioral choices flow from character. Ethics is what people are, and decisions are made based in principle. And so if I want to be an honest person, then all of my actions have to be, all of my decisions have to be honest. So unlike with the ends-based principle, where you make decisions based on things that are happening outside of you, the behavioral choices, according to virtue-based principle, primarily flow from inside information. Well, what is a virtue? Well, it's kind of like the rights and the values we talked about earlier, but to be a bit more specific, and this is from Aristotle, the philosopher, virtues lie at the mean between vices of excess and vices of deficiency. So if courage is the virtue, it lies somewhere between an excess and a deficit of courage. Or sorry, an excess of fear and a deficit of fear. So if there's an excess of fear, we are cowardly. If there's a deficit of fear, we are foolhardy. You know, we're foolhardy. We'll take risks that are crazy risks to take. But if the virtue lies right in the mean of that, you have a little bit of fear but not too much to make you cowardly. You have courage. Another one is justice. And that virtue is about rectifying wrongdoing or retribution. If we have that in excess, it can actually lead to injustice, right? Where maybe we're a vigilante that goes after somebody outside the legal system, and that's unjust. But a deficit of that can also lead to injustice, right? Where we're so merciful to everybody that there's just no justice left in the world. So the virtues are means between an excess of a feeling and a deficit of a feeling or action. And the theory says that we should go for something in the middle. For example, we should be generous, where we, give money to other people, but in excess that's extravagant, where we're just giving all our money away, and in deficit it's being stingy. And there's something in the middle. Same with pride. It's good to be be proud of yourself, but too little of it and you're too humble, and too much of it and you're too vain. There's actually two different virtue-based principle perspectives. One perspective says that virtues help people act ethically. For example, since safety is a prime virtue in engineering, we can ensure safety by double-checking numbers. Therefore, we teach engineering students to double-check numbers in order to help them be virtuous. So we've decided safety is a virtue. We can ensure safety by double-checking numbers. Therefore, let's teach students to double-check numbers, thereby helping them be safe and virtuous. The other perspective says that virtuous people act ethically. For example, a virtuous engineer who has a clean safety record double-checks his numbers. Therefore, double-checking numbers is a virtue that all engineering students should adopt. Neither is wrong nor right. It's just two different ways to go about this virtues-based principle. You can see that they get to the same result. Some criticisms of virtues-based principle. Ethics can't be taught is one criticism. You're either a good person or you're not. Another criticism of the virtues-based principle is it doesn't help you choose an action when two virtues conflict. What if I'm trying to choose between truth and loyalty? What do? This one doesn't really help me because it says both of them are good. It's difficult sometimes to determine where the mean is between vices, unless we usually end up choosing the lesser of two evils. I can't quite figure out where courage lies, so I might end up choosing to be a coward or to be foolhardy. Also, the virtues-based principle requires a great deal of self-awareness. This is why we had you in Unit 1 identify your core ethical values, and we had your team develop your core ethical values so that you could more easily apply the virtue-based principle when you're trying to make decisions, because you've already thought about which values are important to me. So, to summarize all four of these, if we looked at the decisions that people have to make, this is how each of them would go about doing it. So an end-based thinker would identify all the possible courses of action, establish direct and indirect costs and benefits of each action, and then they would select the one action that yields the greatest good for the least amount of harm. And the greatest good is bringing about happiness or pleasure to the most amount of people. A rule-based thinker would first determine if the maximum which they're acting should become universal law or a universal norm. Then they would analyze if that action would degrade others or treat them as a means to an end, because that is not acceptable. And then finally they would question whether the actions violate one's own or another's autonomy, because that's not good either. So do I want it to become a universal law or norm? Would it degrade others, treat them as a means towards an end? Would it violate mine or their autonomy? A virtues-based thinker would keep in mind what kind of person she or he wants to be, and then consider which action would enable him or her to become that kind of person. And they might always ask before they make a final decision, do I want to be the kind of person who would be labeled as a blank? Or I was thinking also that if you think about when I die, I want to be remembered as, that's a kind of virtues-based thinker, would help you make decisions when you're facing them. And finally, a care-based thinker would consider the action. Would I want others to do that action to me? They might also ask, does my action promote the interests or care of others? Or flip side of that, does my action harm others? So those are 4 resolution principles upon which you can make decisions when you are facing an ethical dilemma. They can also help you decide the proper action to take, or justifications justifications for choosing a right action when you're facing a wrong, because other people might question your decision. One caution I guess I want to give you is this rules-based thinker. A lot of students confuse this and think rules-based has to do with the rules, the organizational code of ethics, the professional code of ethics. It's not that kind of rule. It is talking about the universal rule, the universal norm, the universal law that you are willing to become into action. So I'll give you a simple example that doesn't have anything to do with work, but something that involves each of us. When I'll see somebody throw, a piece of garbage on the street instead of in the garbage bin. And most of the time we do that because we think, oh, it's not that big a deal, it's just one piece of garbage, or maybe we even think somebody else will pick it up. But if you just thought, if everybody threw their garbage on the ground, are we okay with that? In other words, if the action of throwing something on the ground would become the universal law or norm or rule, would we be okay with that? And I think in most cases we would say no. So that's what we mean by rule-based. We don't mean the rules that an organization has already codified. That would be a right versus wrong. Here we're talking about how do you decide between a right versus right. Something else we want to talk about, Kidder mentions this. Is there a third option for acting? Before you decide on an action that upholds one right over another, look for what Kidder calls a trilemma, a third option for acting that upholds both rights. These 4 resolution principles may help you do that. For example, if a friend asks you for your paper and you are torn between upholding the right of honesty, which says you should tell her no, that would be cheating, and the right of loyalty, which might say that you should give your friend what she needs, ask yourself, is there a third option for acting that upholds both honesty and loyalty? And those 4 resolution principles might help you get there. Finally, once you've run your options for acting through the resolution principles, you can conduct a second test of the ethicality of your decision. There are 6 conditions a judgment must have in order for it to be considered ethical. It must be impartial, universal, justifiable, overriding, non-negotiable, and action guiding. So let's look at each of these. Is it impartial? Ethical judgment goes beyond you as the stakeholder. It's not just about your self-interest. In other words, you don't choose a resolution to an ethical issue or dilemma because it serves you best. For example, if I allow my peer educators to enter the academic integrity contest that we have every year, people would accuse me of being unethical because they're thinking that we can't be impartial when we're judging the contest winners. The second characteristic of an ethical judgment is, can it be extended universally? Ethical judgments can apply to everyone in relevantly similar circumstances. Again, this gets back to the rule-based thinking. For example, my judgment isn't simply a matter between the involved parties in one particular place at one particular time. It must be able to apply to others in relatively similar circumstances. For example, if it is judged to be unethical for a secretary to take work supplies home for personal use, then it is also unethical for the CEO to do so. In other words, just because other people do it, it doesn't mean it's okay, and it shouldn't sway your ethical judgment. Thirdly, is the judgment or decision justifiable? You must be able to defend an ethical judgment with reason, facts, or logic. This kind of takes us back to Unit 1, where we talked about the difference between standards of personal preference, etiquette, professional, legal, regulatory, or ethics. I don't eat meat pizza as a preference, but the following is an ethical judgment. You shouldn't eat meat pizza because the meat industry treats animals inhumanely. Ethical standards depend on the quality of the arguments or the reasoning that supports them. That's really important. Is it justifiable? Fourth, does it override other standards? Ethical judgments or standards take priority over other judgments or standards. For example, I can't justify a personal preference for broadcasting a cheating story on Twitter if it violates an ethical standard that it is wrong to reveal student identities. Next, is it non-negotiable? Ethical judgments are binding, not to be modified by other factors like inconvenience or hardship. For example, I think it's wrong to give my best friend my lab reports from last quarter, even though everyone else around me seems to think it's okay. The decision then is not up for further discussion or modification, or what others might say is justifications or rationalizations. So, for example, I think it's wrong, but then someone says to me, but she's your best friend and she has been there for you, therefore you should give them to her. Well, you're right, she's my best friend, she's been there for me, and I will continue to be there for her in many ways, but not in a way that is potentially dishonest and a violation of our academic integrity. I will not give her my lab reports from last quarter. But maybe she'll dump you as a friend. Perhaps she will, but I will not be giving her my lab reports. So you can see in that little conversation I just had between two people, that was non-negotiable. The student had made an ethical judgment and it wasn't going to be modified or rationalized by other factors. Finally, when someone offers an ethical judgment, you have to ask, does it guide action? Ethical judgments demand action. When we consider the ethics of something, it's an applied or practical question. Should or shouldn't someone do something? Otherwise, it's hypocrisy. I judge something as ethical, but act otherwise. Thus, according to Shaw, when someone offers an ethical judgment, they are implying that it is impartial, it applies to everyone in relatively similar circumstances, it can be justified, it takes precedence over other standards, it is non-negotiable, and demands action. If it fails on any of these conditions, it is not an ethical judgment, but perhaps a judgment disguised as ethical. These conditions can then be used as a test to see if someone is talking about an ethical option, whether they say they are or not. So some final thoughts on improving ethical decision making. You should base your decisions on data rather than assumptions or opinions. Before you act, stop and ask yourself, how might I be wrong? Or what should I know but don't? Or as Bazerman and Tenbunzel suggest, what ethical action implications might arise from our decision? Find the answer to these questions before acting. Second, think about all those impacted by your action, even when you're using something other than the ends-based or care-based principle. Why? Because it forces you to consider the situation from multiple viewpoints and form a more comprehensive picture of the issue. Make a list of those impacted stakeholders, and don't forget about the external community. And don't forget about the future ones as well. And then evaluate the decision from their perspective. Finally, be honest with yourself and others. Use Kidder's test to help you do this. Again, we often like to fool ourselves that something isn't a wrong, so using our test for right versus wrong or Kidder's test for ethical dilemmas will help you be honest with yourself and others. And then debrief your decisions with at least one trusted colleague before you spring into action.